And then we're going to have with us in just a few, Maria Lisa, who is the clerk of the council. The reason that we're here tonight is on the ballot in November, there is a proposed charter amendment. The charter is the city's constitution, and you're going to be deciding a couple things. One is electing your council members, or the registered voters that live within that same district. The second thing that's going to be decided as part of that charter amendment on the ballot is how the redistricting, how future district maps are going to be formed. And essentially that's going to be that they're going to be formed in compliance with state and federal laws. So the important part tonight, though, is that you are going to be part of participating in the process of deciding how these maps are formed. We have Paul again with Redistricting Partners, who is going to go ahead and kind of guide you through the process on some of the factors that you look at as part of districting, communities of interest. But I won't steal his thunder here. I'll go ahead and let him run with this show. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like was mentioned, I'm with Redistricting Partners. I've been doing redistricting around the state for agencies like Santa Ana that are in what are considered an at-large election system, in which the elections are held where everybody in the city votes for representatives, and that are converting to a by-district system where each district will only have voters vote for one individual member. Are we okay? You can just talk to them if you want over there. I won't be distracted if you want to just talk. That's going to talk about some of the things that have already been mentioned. First off, when we talk about the CVRA, the two components that we talk about are racially polarized voting and at-large election systems. And essentially, if you have one, you are not allowed to have the other. While federal law uses the idea of majority-minority, that if you have an area that can be majority of one ethnicity that's an underrepresented minority, that you have to convert to districts. Under state law, we're simply looking for the ability to influence elections. In addition, the CVRA makes it easier for plaintiffs to come forward and sue and guarantees them damages, meaning that they get paid no matter what happens. The redistricting process is traditionally, I will use the words interchangeably. The redistricting process is every 10 years we come and redraw these boundaries. And what we're doing here is converting them not only to new boundaries, but also a system where they're electing one person per city council member area. We're always concerned that redistricting is going to be done in a way that isn't fair, that is trying to seek advantage unfairly for certain groups or individuals. So the way that we do it follows some set redistricting criteria, traditional redistricting criteria that's either in statute, meaning it's actual law, or it has come down as case law, like the Supreme Court has decided on it, and so we follow Supreme Court precedents. Some of these are as recent as last year. One of them is that districts will be equal size in terms of population, This doesn't mean citizens, it doesn't mean adults, it doesn't mean registered voters, it means total population. And that was one of the issues that came before the Supreme Court last year. Based on the 2010 population, the U.S. Census, the number we're going to use is that the city is approximately 325,000 people. That means the average district size will be around 54,000 people, with the largest district probably being around 55 and a half, and the smallest being maybe 52 and a half. The operative thing is that when we draw these lines, the biggest district and the smallest district are not going to be separated by more than 5%. When we talk about the ethnicity of a district, we use a slightly different number, a slightly different data set. For ethnicity of the district, we're looking at people who are eligible voters, essentially, over 18 years old and citizens. And so when I say this little pocket is 32% Asian or this little pocket is 78% Latino, I mean, if you were to take out all the kids and take out all the non-citizens, what would be the ethnic makeup of that area? So we're really specifically talking about that. And the reason we're talking about that is because we're going to draw these districts with the idea that we are trying to maximize the voting strength. And so the fact that a district has 100,000 under 16-year-old, doesn't matter. What matters is who's eligible to vote, essentially, and that would be citizens over 18. Another criteria is that districts will be contiguous, meaning whole parts. We're not going to have a district start in one part of the city, disappear, start up somewhere else. They're going to be whole parts. And it sounds funny, but in LA County, I saw a water board that created districts that weren't even contiguous. We're going to maintain communities of interest. And communities of interest is essentially there's two different types. One type of community of interest is the federally protected minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. And in that list, we look at Latinos, Asians, African Americans. If we were doing this redistricting in El Centro in northern San Diego County, we would be mapping the Chaldean population, which is Iraqi Catholics. If we were doing this redistricting in Glendale, we'd be mapping Armenian populations. If we were doing this redistricting in Bakersfield, we'd be mapping Basque populations. So whenever we're doing redistricting, we're looking at the communities, and the first kind of highest tier of these communities of interest are those that have protection under federal and state law as minority populations. When we look at these minority populations, we can see that there are two main populations that rise to the level of being dense enough within the city of Santa Ana to be able to influence the outcome of an election through kind of block voting. And that would be Asian population, Latino population. Asian population we show as being 17%, but it is not equally dispersed throughout the city. And Latino population is 60%. And again, it's not equally dispersed. There are some places that are very, very high Latino and some places that are less so. When we look at the city, we essentially create these heat maps to show where the density is of the ethnicity. We can see the Latino population, and there are certain pockets, in the presentation is printed, you can see a little more clear. There are certain pockets here where it's very dark blue, meaning that those areas are 70, 80, 90% Latino. We also have an Asian population, and as you can see, it's even more dramatically kind of located in certain parts of the city. And when we look at some of the densest portions, both on the eastern and southeastern portions of the city, we see areas with 50, 60, 30, 20% Asian, depending on where you're looking. A second tier of community of interest would be the communities within the city and how they identify, how they communicate with each other, how they, where their kids go to school together, or where they go to the same parks, or where they share the same concerns about transportation, or maybe they share the same concerns about workforce, or maybe in some parts of the city the big issue is parking, and in another part of the city the big issue is those people using Waze to get through the neighborhoods, or Uber drivers, or whatever. Communities of interest means things that bring people together. And the idea in districting is to try to draw people together in a way that that voice can be as strong as possible and their interests can be essentially magnified through the districting process. Another thing that we do in order to try to make sure that we're drawing districts in a way that is fair and consistent with state and federal law is to try wherever we can to follow existing boundaries of governmental agencies, things that exist out there where people could be using that as a kind of a proxy for a community of interest. So, a real great example is, I jokingly say that people's identity is, what city they grew up in, what high school they went to, right? And that those are really preeminent in people's minds when they're thinking about their community of interest. So you could think of overlapping boundaries as being something that we can use as building blocks for the districting process. And to note, these are different depending on what kind of agency you're drawing districts for. So last night, I was drawing districts for a harbor district in San Mateo County, where they literally were drawing districts and they were looking at the two harbors and trying to draw districts that represented the views of people who were using the harbor. I don't think anybody in Santa Ana cares about a harbor as their driving force of what they view as their community, but in Santa Ana there might be different things. Keeping districts compact. And compact doesn't mean small. I've drawn districts that are 100 miles across. But what compact means is it's more of a mathematical equation. The most compact shape in science is a sphere, or a square, or a triangle. We're looking at things that are rather consistent in their shape, not just a bunch of squiggly lines. If you look at congressional districts in some parts of the country, you'll see things that look worse than that gerrymander cartoon. You'll see things that look like Swiss cheese. And we're going to draw districts that look like areas that make sense. And if there is an aberration from that, if we have a redistricting plan where a district takes on a strange shape, we're going to have a justification of it from these other criteria. We're going to say that district might look like it's squiggly line, but it's actually just the exterior boundary of the city. Or that district might look like it has an elongated shape, but that's actually the shape of the neighborhood that that district was based on. So we're going to be justifying any kind of squiggly shapes or lines. When we look at the current districts, the one thing that jumps out at people when they look at this, given this far in the presentation, is the fact that I pointed out that there's an Asian population on the eastern side of the map. And look at what the current districts have done. The current districts have it so that there's 3 council districts that all touch that very heavy Asian population. Now, there could have been a justification for that at the time. Somebody could have said, this plan has 6 districts, and 3 of the districts all have heavy Asian populations, so these 3 council members are going to have an extra sensitivity to the needs of the Asian community. However, redistricting law has gone the other direction. It has not said, give every council member one little piece of that community so that they're all paying attention to it. It has said, give one council member enough of that population can have the effectiveness, be able to be able to elect a candidate of their choice. So essentially 2 ends of the spectrum. Do we take a community that's a community of interest and divide it up so 5% of it's in every council district? Or we take a community that's a community of interest and draw it into one council district so it can have a stronger voice? Redistricting law has favored that second option. One of the things that we looked at immediately was underlying governmental boundaries. And one underlying boundary that isn't necessarily governmental, but does have interactions with the city and does have boundaries that were essentially drawn through a back and forth with the city. These are not willy-nilly lines, is the neighborhoods. And the maps do show how the current districts are drawn based on using the neighborhoods as a starting point. When we look at these neighborhoods, the handouts has a real handy little chart to show the different neighborhoods and some different ways of looking at them. First off, we can see the population of each of these neighborhoods. We can also see what part of that population is citizens over the age of 18, meaning people who could be eligible voters. Then it looks at the Latino and Asian breakdown of these neighborhoods, so you can see that Artesia Pillar or Bella Vista. Bella Vista, as an example, is 79% Latino, but only 6% Asian. Now, as we went further, another layer that we started to look at, and I want you to bookmark this in your mind, is the school district boundaries. And the reason I wanted you to bookmark this is because look at Garden Grove Unified School District. Garden Grove Unified School District almost looks as if it was attached to the city. And it goes on the east side of the Santa Ana River. There's one little pocket, but mostly it's right there. And it's very clearly a boundary that we could potentially use in drawing district lines. We have state legislative districts. State legislative districts might not have been drawn perfectly listening to the city of Santa Ana, but I know that they had community meetings in Santa Ana and around here to get input from the local residents about how to draw the city count, how to draw the lines. Congressional districts, same thing. Essentially, the congressional districts we can look at and we can say there's a little aha moment. It looks as though the 46th Congressional District was drawn to maximize the Latino population, and it looks as though 48th Congressional District was drawn to maximize the Asian population. So there might have been community input on this, but I see this, and looking at the prior boundaries, I think to myself that there is a very clear, distinction there between these two areas, the green and the pink in this map. And then finally, we also have precincts. Precincts are a rather small geography, but precincts actually are drawn to make some sense. If you're drawn in the same precinct with 1,500 people, then by definition, all 1,500 of you can get to the same polling place. They've determined that you guys are all walking distance from the library. They're not going to take a precinct and put half of a precinct on one side of a river and half of a precinct on the other, or the other side of a freeway. They're not going to put precincts together in a way that doesn't make sense. So precincts are there, and we might fall back on precincts at one time or another in order to determine how to draw district boundaries. So I have to date drawn 4 plans. And the first plan is a plan that looks at that essentially draws most from the existing city boundaries. It still has a little bit of a split in that Asian community, and if we were to take the Garden Grove Unified School District as an example, you can see as a product of it having been drawn somewhat based on the existing boundaries, we gave a lot more of this heavily Asian population to District A, but still have the Garden Grove Unified School District portion in 3 different council districts. So if you were to say, my ethnicity is Asian, I am Vietnamese, I identify with the Garden Grove Unified School District, you might think that this plan does a little bit of kind of chopping that up. However, what it does do at the same time is it increases the ethnic population. It grows the Asian population in that one district that I was pointing to, 43% Asian. That's significantly higher than any of the numbers in the existing plans. Just to walk through this for a second, we've already talked about population, 2010 census. We've talked about citizen voting age population, meaning a proxy for eligible voters, Latino and Asian citizen voting age population. We also have African American citizen voting age and white citizen voting age population. For our purposes, we really want to look most heavily at Asian to see if we can draw districts where the Asian community can best influence the outcome of an election, and then also Latino and what districts are essentially majority minority Latino.
Can you go over that again?
Yeah.
You're looking at.
Do we have a power cord for this?
Partner?
We need a power cord because it just said low power. not plugged in. There we go. That'll work. Thanks. I'm sorry, the question was?
Can you go over that again?
Yeah, so as I've been going through these numbers, I've been introducing essentially different ways of counting. Population. We're counting every person, man, woman, child, citizen, non-citizen, living in a house, an apartment, under a bridge, every human being that was in this city April 2010 based on the U.S. Census. Citizen voting age population. This number is not everybody. It's everybody who is a citizen and over the age of 18. This actually comes from a newer data set from the American Community Survey, which is a part of the U.S. Census. So you can think of this as the big population number. We're going to make these districts equal based on population. This number, we're going to use this number to determine how ethnic each district is. And when we look at this number, we see these numbers are derived from citizen voting age population. Latino, white, African American, and Asian.
But can you go over that again? What I asked is, you're saying of the Vietnamese population. What did you say in that?
I said Asian population.
You said Asian and Vietnamese.
So the Asian population on that chart is 43% Asian.
And then you said we're going to draw a district for.
The computer did? Okay. So what I was saying there is that the Asian 43% means that 43% of that District A that was drawn is Asian. And when I say 43% of the district's Asian, I don't literally mean 43% of the people in that whole district are Asian. I mean 43% of the citizens who are over 18 are Asian. And some of them are going to be Vietnamese, some of them Chinese, Korean, different nationalities, but they're all considered by the census to be Asian. For some reason, well, what's convenient is that if for some reason the power's not working on the monitor, we're actually okay. Everybody, okay. The plans are all on the wall, and in fact, I can just show you guys. Most people have the packets as well. Each of these plans on the wall have the breakdown of the map and the data table, and you should have those handouts as well. And then these maps you can look at individually. These maps are a little bit more glossed on more street details, and they also have the neighborhood. You can see the neighborhood more clearly. When we did the alternate versions of these plans, plans B, C, and D, we were trying to incorporate different concepts. Plan B was the first one where we essentially looked at trying to make more of the Garden Grove district whole and capture some of the Asian population that was on the other side of the Santa River. Go back here. Perfect, thank you guys. So this was Plan A. District A in Plan A, 43% Asian. And that is, given that they were the plaintiffs, that's an important thing to look at. But this Plan A draws more from the existing boundaries. Plan B starts to incorporate more of this area north and on the same side as the Santa Ana River, and tries to maximize the Asian population in that district. And it gets to 45% citizen voting age population Asian. The number in the lower left-hand corner is the Asian population. Plan C, again, that lower left-hand corner number is 44%. This tries a different concept. This plan really looks at the Asian population that we saw, very heavy Asian population in the southeast portion of the city. And it says, can we take this Asian population in the southeast portion of the city and merge it with the other Asian population up here? Essentially saying, is the Asian population in this area more cohesive, more community of interest than if we drew it going this way? And that's something for the community to tell us. You know, it could be that the Asian population up here spends more time in this part of the city, and the Asian population here spends more time in this part of the city. And it's a question as to what is the better representation of the communities of interest. Plan D is again 44% citizen voting age population Asian, but taking you back to what I asked you to bookmark when we were looking at the initial overview of governmental lines, this Plan A is essentially the Garden Grove Input School District. So the overlap here allows the Asian community, if this is the way that it best perceives itself, to be in this district, and then another portion of the Asian community down here would be in this district F. By the way, at the last hearing, at the first hearing, somebody asked me why these all have letters. And the reason these have letters is that the council seats have numbers, and at some point they're going to have to number this map. And the numbering of the map is going to matter about what seats come up when. So I didn't want to say that this is District 1 or District 2 or whatever, because it might predispose people to thinking that this election for this district would come up in a given year, or this district might come up in another year. So letters helps us keep that a little bit more abstract. And that is the presentation. We have a number of additional meetings that are all posted on the website. We also have maps on the wall. The idea with these hearings as community meetings is to get two types of input. One type of input is, this is my community of interest. We are people who work in a certain workforce. We are people who go to a certain church. We are people who have our kids in the same daycare or whatever it's going to be. I've even seen somebody came to one of these meetings with a Boy Scouts of America map and said, look, our Boy Scout troop is this area, and this area over here is the other Boy Scout troop. So communities of interest information just in the abstract is one. The second type of input, which is very valuable, is people looking at the maps. And people look at the maps and they say, these two neighborhoods shouldn't be in different districts. These two neighborhoods should be together. Or they say, our community is stronger in the northern part than the southern part, so the district should go towards the north. Whatever. But it's about relating your concepts about communities of interest to the actual lines that are available. And I think with that, that's the presentation. The process is for the public to have any input. The tools are primarily on the website. That if people have comments or questions, I think there's a 3-minute. The 3 minutes per speaker, and you can come up and ask a question or make a statement. Yes?
For the presentations that you just did with each of the 4 different plans, was it just solely done based off of ethnicity? Because I know you explained it through the lens of the Asian community, but did you do it with different like characteristic or demographic as well, or was it just based off of the...
That's a super question. And it's an extremely important question too, because we're here because of the California Voting Rights Act. We're here because of a civil rights claim. And so we have to be cognizant of the ethnic populations when we are talking about it. However, when we draw districts, we can't make that the only criteria upon which we're drawing districts. And if you were to ask me what is the driving criteria of each of these boundaries, and you were to look at the maps, It's the neighborhoods. I think the primary criteria we were using was trying to draw districts that made sense and at the same time would allow for a maximization or at least a good representation of the Asian community, given that they were the plaintiffs, and also the Latino community, given that there's a large population of Latinos in the district. So we draw districts cognizant of, and we review districts very strongly based on making sure that they don't deprive an ethnic population of their rights. But when we're drawing boundaries, a lot of the driving factors have to do with those governmental boundaries. So the school district boundaries and neighborhoods.
But I guess I'm also asking, like, did you look at income? Did you look at education? Like, all other demographics of the area?
So in different redistrictings, we'll look at different things. And oftentimes the community comes forward and says, we really want to look at educational attainment, as an example. And oftentimes, like in a community college redistricting, you'll look at high school graduation rates, college going rates, and all of that data is data that we have. When you do redistricting, sometimes you look at high income versus low income areas. You definitely can do that. Oftentimes, though, the neighborhoods themselves have essentially done some of that work for you. And essentially, the neighborhoods do oftentimes, encapsulate different socioeconomic demographics. To put it another way, very few neighborhoods are bridging together, a very poor community and a very wealthy community. Oftentimes, they serve as a proxy. So when we do overlay something like income, oftentimes we see, these neighborhoods have already been divided based on income. And so wouldn't expect it to change a lot. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. She just emphasized the reason for my question earlier, because you did mention that you were looking at a Vietnamese district. Although you might have slipped the tongue or said the wrong thing, etc., but rather than an Asian district or an Asian population. The point you just made was that because of the legal action or lawsuit or claim, that you're looking at drawing an Asian district, and while at the same time not deflating the numbers for the Latino community. My question is, if the lawsuit was brought by a Latino group, would you be saying that you were looking to do a Latino district while at the same time not deflating the numbers for an Asian population?
Yeah, I think that when you're drawing districts, what you mainly want to do is make sure that you're not disenfranchising voter communities. And if I were to take the existing plans and lay it over the maps that we showed, one thing that's very distinctive is that the Asian population has been divided into 3 council districts. There are multiple. It's very clear that looking at the existing council district lines, that the Asian community is divided into the 3 council districts. And there are council districts also that are majority and supermajority Latino. And under each of the plans, we would definitely look, if there was a version of a plan that we saw was dividing the Latino community and weakening their voting power as a result of it, we would definitely look at that. However, in the city of Santa Ana, if you take a council district from being 83% Latino to 74% Latino, you're not having a difference in the effective majority-minority status of that council district. So no matter who brought forward the claim in the city of Santa Ana, we'd be looking to make sure we're not dividing communities.
Looking at communities of interest, what are the commonalities of the Asian community? The commonalities of Japanese, Korean, Cambodians, Chinese, Mongolians. What are the commonalities of those communities, of the Asian American communities, of those different?
That is something that we really are looking for community input for. and to hear from the community about communities of interest, because it could be arguable that the Asian community here and the Asian community here are more cohesive than they are with other parts of the district. So we don't attempt to say we know which parts of the city have different Asian populations that feel cohesive and that are communities of interest. What we're here to is listen for that information. So we're kind of trying to be receptacle for exactly what you're talking about. Because if the census says these people are X, that can't be the only thing that drives redistricting. If that were true, we could just write a program to redistrict everything. The fact is that redistricting requires trade-offs, and oftentimes those trade-offs can be within an ethnic community in order to determine how best to draw districts that reflect the needs of the voters and the population.
So when we look at communities of interest, we're not looking at communities of interest of your citizen voting age population. You're looking at it in terms of the general larger community, but you don't have the numbers showing the population of the larger community. Why are you not? Would it be disservice to our communities that you are not providing the data of the total population?
Yeah. So when we're looking at the citizen voting age population for Asian, that's because the law demands it.
I'm saying overall population.
So when we're talking about how many Asians are in a district, the law demands that we look at citizen voting age population. When we make trade-offs,
but you're not providing data on total population.
we definitely have the data on total population. It's just not operative.
What do you mean it's not operative?
It doesn't make a difference in how we draw the districts.
I realize that, but you're not providing that data.
We do definitely have it. There's reams of data that we can provide.
You're not providing the data.
So, to back up, what's operative in drawing districts under redistricting is that when you're drawing districts, they all have to be total population equal. Period. When you're drawing districts and you're trying to determine their ethnicity, then you're using citizen voting age population. That's what you're using. We have reams of data. I probably have thousands of different data points on over 18 non-citizens, over 18 citizens, people who are under 18, people by different age groups, people how long their commutes are to work, people who income level, education level, and all those things, but really trying to distill the presentation down to the things that are going to be operative, that are going to judge if this went into a courtroom, whether this plan is fair. We are required to use the citizen voting.
I understand that, but aren't you shortchanging the community by not providing the additional information that you do have and you can provide, although you're not using it to draw your lines?
Yeah, there is...
You are shortchanging our community then.
Oh, absolutely not. That data, if the public did come forward, and like she mentioned, could we see education or housing data? Absolutely. If
So
the public
can you provide that data at the next meeting in addition to the public hearing?
Sure.
And you'll be able to provide that within the next?
It would have to be a question as to how much information. I don't know if we can make it up.
And you said
what is the specific?
You said you've done my district elections. You're looking at the total population, the over 18 population as well, in addition to the citizen voting age population.
Okay. So all you're looking for.
What the information that you provided in other cities or entities that have gone through by-district elections.
So you're asking for, just to be clear, you're asking for the over 18 period population. The population that's over 18.
Over 18 is total population.
Of each ethnicity. Period. That's fine.
So don't stop there. Don't stop there. Other information that is pertinent, that will assist the community, to assist them in terms of trying to understand what we're doing.
Okay.
Leave that up to you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Yeah. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, just a question.
Yeah, sure.
On Plan D, which is Oklahoma,
Yeah.
you have the A, plan, Section A, as a regular unified school district. On all the other sections, did you take into account what high school they go to, or could it be that Because you're doing it on the whole district itself, on Garden Grove.
Yeah.
But does the other section, the Santa Ana, the Unified School District, divide through high school, or would it divide in between?
Yeah, so essentially what is being asked is, we have a high school, we have the district, but in each district there are service areas for each campus. And so it might be a perfect example of maybe some community of interest testimony. It might be that somebody comes forward and says, let's say somebody comes forward and says, this portion here, all these kids go to a different high school, so it's not really as important. But these kids down here are all going to the same church as these kids here. And so the community of interest testimony is what helps make these decisions in terms of those trade-offs. So, no, I don't have the service areas or the campuses, which campuses are serving which kids in the Garden Grove Unified School District. But if that was something that was felt to be helpful, then I'm sure I could contact the district and try to get that. And I do have a layer in the database that has every high school, every school, period, that I can put together on that. Yeah.
On Plan B and C,
Uh-huh.
I noticed that there is West Riverbend, there is a little hook shape. Is there a reason for that?
That little hook shape?
Yeah.
It's not really. The existing boundaries of the existing council district come into this area. Essentially, just has to come with balancing population. And if you're balancing population, how do you do that? You take into account the existing neighborhood lines. It's not ideal, but if we were to go down here, we have too much. In order to get to the Asian community that's on this side, we have to lose something over here. So it's just a question of how. And I think that if we were to draw it in a way that would go a little bit north here, that we're cutting into a dense Asian population, and cutting like this just seemed to do the least harm when you're trying to balance overall population. So if somebody said, this is the plan we want, but we want to clean this up and see if there's a way to reach population equality a different path, then we can come up with a couple different alternatives to this little hook. But clearly that's something visually that stands out. You're right. Yes?
John, I just thought of a question. Did you take into consideration density trends based on the city's general plan updates where large apartment complexes are undergoing or under construction or being planned in certain corridors of the city to increase the density?
Yeah. This is a perfect question. And it's a question that comes up in a lot of redistricting. And we have the city of Santa Ana, and we're dealing with the population based on the 2010 census. You know, what doesn't make sense about this from a layperson perspective is you could say, well, there's this huge development that just came in here. That's going to throw the districts out of whack. Like, why are we doing that? And we need to redraw this district in a way that we're going to underpopulate this district in the 2010 census numbers to account for the fact that we know that there's a whole bunch of people here that weren't counted in 2010. But we can't do that. The law doesn't allow us to do that. The law freezes 2010 in time, and the law says that we would be essentially in violation of traditional redistricting principles if we were to undersize a district because we know for some other data set that there's new population there. We have to have justifications. If we're going to underpopulate a district, we have to have arguments based on keeping a neighborhood whole, on keeping a community of interest whole, on following governmental lines. We have to do it on other bases. We can't do it on the basis of, like, we know that there's more people there than the census reported, because it becomes a slippery slope.
Okay, so
Santa Ana
question would begin, if this is adopted, whatever plan is adopted, this has to be redrawn in 2020, correct?
2012, 2022.
2022.
Yeah, but for 2022, the redistricting has to happen. And the best thing that we can do is make the districts very, 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 very close to equal size. Like, a 1% deviation. Because that would reduce the likelihood that these districts are going to have to be significantly redrawn. But we can't really account for like that we know a development here. And the reason I say it's a slippery slope is that if you were to talk to any demographer in California, they would tell you that the grossest undercount in the U.S. Census was in the city of Santa Ana. And so there is a large undercount, particularly of non-citizen Latino populations in the city of Santa Ana, and particularly non-citizen Latino kids. And if we were to start saying, well, we know the population here is actually higher than the U.S. Census because of the gross undercount, then we start getting into this game. And so what we choose to do and what we follow is what the law says, which is we use the 2010 census, flaws and all, like it's, fact. Yeah.
If I may, for those that don't know who I am, I'm Maria Weezer, the city clerk here for the city. Two things. You have some really good questions. I'd like to encourage you to put your comments, if you are requesting information, to put it in writing and submit it to us so that we have record and that we make sure that we get back to you. And so you can submit that request over to our office, to the city clerk's office, either by emailing me directly. My email should be on the notices, or you can submit it to the e-comments at santana.org, santana.org email account. The other thing is I'd like to plug in the census survey is coming out shortly. I'd like to encourage you and your neighbors all to complete the census information because it's really critical and important for you all to participate and be counted. Not only for this effort, but for grant monies and for other purposes to really know exactly how many residents we have in the city. So I'd like to just do a plug-in for the census survey that's coming up shortly.
Okay.
I was just going to add, if you have opinions about certain maps and why, let's say you mentioned the hook, and that was very astute. If you don't think that accurately represents the district that it is wanted to, then we need to hear that, and we need to hear it in writing. So if you have comments about specific maps that are out there, it's really important that you don't just say that's a bad map. It's why it's a bad map. Let's say it's cutting off a school, or give us some facts, the inclusion that we talked about, that will factually support why we're going to choose a specific map.
Question?
Yeah.
I went to the first one that you had, meeting that you had, and I had to delay. It was probably about 2 hours long. My question deals with process. And we have several maps that you are providing the community for their observation and input. I'm not sure if you drew the demographer, the contractor, the consultant, drew these maps without input from council members or with input. Through our organization, we've been involved with several by-district efforts before in various cities here in Orange County. The other cities allow for input by the public in terms of drawing their own maps, submitting their own maps. We don't have that here in the city of Santa Ana. Is there still an opportunity for the community to submit their own maps? And in terms of the process itself, will the community, by affording the community the opportunity to say this is the map they like, are you looking at adding up the totals, etc., and providing to the city council a report?
So let me.
of the community? And if
You're going to have too many.
would the city council be able to change any plan that the community might be advising that they prefer?
Okay, I'm going to start with the most recent.
Pardon?
I'm going to start with the most recent, the last part of your question, which is the city council will have the ability to amend before they adopt a plan. It is ultimately a choice of the city council as to which plan gets adopted through this process. The community of interest, the original drawing of these plans were drawn after we've had several meetings and had a website up where people could submit community of interest and draw maps of their own, and those were utilized in the creation of these plans. And then Maria, do you want to speak to, are we going to have the mapping thing again?
So we have a tool on our website under the ward redistricting.
I didn't think it went anywhere, it's still there.
The ward redistricting webpage, where there's a tool there where you can include your community of interest. It does not include the statistics, but if you tell us what your interests are, we can gather that information and be able to produce a map for you.
And all
It doesn't
input.
allow a community group and or individual to do their own maps and to submit that.
Right.
Yes, they can draw the communities of interest, and they can draw them with as much detail as they want, and submit that. And that's the process that we've had up there for a couple months. And then the one question you had in the middle there was, is all this input going to be given to the city council? The answer is yes. Every time somebody writes an email or submits something on the website, that information is going to be handed to the attorneys, to the demographer, and being provided in a report to the city. Yes?
We know that at the end, city council is going to choose between the different states.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so one thing, like, are they going to take into consideration there's going to be a way to make it public what the community is saying? This is the one that we really like to compare to the one that the city will choose, the city council will choose.
Yeah, that's what this process is for, and what is available on the website is for people to be able to engage in that way. And clearly, if the public is engaged and advocating for a particular plan, that's going to, I would guess, weigh heavily on the process. In my experience, the public input has always been really heavily used in whatever final plan has been adopted in all the redistrictings that I've done. And our firm specifically does not work with cities or local governments who are trying to thwart the interest of the communities that they're serving or try to do plans that don't follow these criteria. So, yeah.
Also, there's a series of public hearings that are taking place. There's a meeting specifically on October 30th that the city council is having. That's actually the meeting where the council will be adopting the map. So that's a super important meeting for you all to come to. It'll be on Tuesday, October 30th in the council chamber at 5:45. So I encourage you all to attend that meeting. That will be the meeting where they adopt the map.
And if I can just add, there are going to be 3 additional city council meetings
council, the present city council, will adopt this. And if it is approved in the November elections, then the city council, the new city council in December, may take a second look at it and decide they want to scratch it, or decide they want to change it, or even decide that they want to change it to the point that to protect the incumbent, because that's allowable in some ways. They may decide that they want to change in mass or overall the boundaries.
I think you'd have a real big problem with plaintiffs if the council ended up doing that. So I think the likelihood of something like that happening is slim. You're right. I have seen this happen in other jurisdictions where existing incumbents are accommodated, but I think the likelihood of that being totally modified in this scenario is slim to none.
Yeah.
So I know earlier you were mentioning about the Asian population, that this was done with that act of plaintiffs. What about all the other, because since most of them are concentrated on the west end of the city, how are all the other districts drawn? Also, is it limited to 6 wards, or is there the possibility of 7 or something like that?
To speak to your first question, a lot of the boundary decisions that were made had to do with existing neighborhoods, trying to keep neighborhoods whole, trying to in some ways follow the existing architecture of the existing districts where there was no reason not to. As an example, it won't come up now, but the existing city boundaries have this, northern district, and most of the plans we essentially preserve the idea, except for one where we split that northern district. So big macro changes like that were, in some cases, they were following what is existing council district boundaries. And in other cases, what they were trying to do is best fit together the neighborhood. So if I was drawing something and I realized moving a line on one end of a district ends up splitting 3 neighborhoods, then I would go back and try not to split those 3 neighborhoods. So those kind of trade-offs were made in order to try to kind of make some sense out of it. There's also within the city some areas that are rather sparsely populated and some areas that are very densely populated. So if there's a sparsely populated area in one of the plans, you might see it's always paired with the same neighborhoods. It just kind of made sense. Why would you come around from another area to come grab something that only has 600 people in it, So there was some of that just kind of natural. And one of the things that's interesting about redistricting is oftentimes when you're looking at something like this in 6 districts, if you took 10 different people, 80% of the district boundaries we would draw would be very similar to each other just because of the way that the city lays itself out. Alrighty?
Then I think you asked about the number of wards.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That would have to require an additional vote for the people to modify that. So we don't.
So there was no way of pulling a 7th or 8th.
I think that'd gather mean a vote of the public, yeah.
Right, that's in our charter, and the only way you can amend the charter is by the vote of the people. You all would have to decide whether you want to increase or decrease that number.
In your drawing, did you see that necessity of having to do a 7th or 8th ward, like full and everything?
No, I didn't. And in fact, it's a really good question because there are agencies that have more fluidity in their ability to add members. So like community colleges, I worked on a bill in the legislature with the Community College League that allowed community colleges as part of this process to increase the number of trustees. And one of the reasons why was that we would see that with going from 7 to 8 to 9 trustees, you could make districts that are small enough to really maximize and create a majority-minority Latino district or a majority-minority Asian district. I didn't see anything here that spoke to, if only we could make districts 35,000 people, I could draw an Asian district that's 55% Asian. I didn't see something like that jump out at me. But I have seen that in other jurisdictions, and I've advised other agencies to increase the number of board members where it was something that was within their ability. Like the Harbor District that we did the redistricting, finalized that last night. they have 5-member boards, and one of the members asked about increasing to 7, but it's actually theirs is in the state code. So there's always rules like that. So with that, thank you very much for coming, and any input you can give that's written or online is wonderful. And we're going to have more of these, and so I appreciate having you here. Thank you. And special thanks to the kids who sat through this. My daughter is 9, and she's been to many of these, so good job, Dad.